When it comes to the Pacific Front of World War II, it's not all that hard to end up thinking of the kamikaze pilots. Theirs is often a simplified story of service that wasn't always voluntary. Think they all wanted to be kamikaze pilots? It's not that straightforward. By the last few years of World War II, things weren't going Japan's way. The Japanese military was wildly outmatched compared to the Allied forces. Their air force wasn't what it used to be, and they'd lost a lot of their skilled pilots over the course of the war. Combined with a higher quality of training and funding given to American pilots and the more powerful aircraft used by the Allied forces, Japan knew they couldn't keep up. It didn't take long for those discrepancies to really rear their ugly head. According to an interview with former pilot Atsushi Takasuka, the Japanese military was well aware they were losing more and more battles. Military leaders started increasing their recruitment, drafting university students into the war who had previously been exempt, but it wasn't enough. Discussions began around fall 1943 about new tactics, but when Japan couldn't stop the Allied forces' march across the Pacific in 1944, they had to do something. Enter the Tokotai, or Special Attack Units. These were the units intended to carry out suicide missions, and it just showed how desperate the situation truly was. The Japanese military was trying to overcome their handicaps at any and all costs, planning on the one last effective defense against the Allies, which they would use through the last stages of the war. The kamikaze pilots became one of the more recognizable units of the Japanese military, but their suicide tactic wasn't unique. Really, they were only one of the units under the umbrella of Special Attack Forces. In 1942, Japan sent out a group that was a precursor to the Special Attack Forces. They weren't exactly suicide missions, but were small groups sent out at night, meant to decimate enemy bases with hit-and-run tactics. At least some of the men were expected to survive, though the mentality was the same. Maximum damage with the least resources. But there were other official special attack forces too. Atsushi Takasuka mentions the Kaiten, or human torpedoes. They were manned suicide torpedo missions. One man would be seated inside the torpedo and drive it into the side of an enemy ship, exploding on contact. In the same vein, there were also the suicide crash boats and tiny submarines that served similar purposes. By the end of the war, suicide missions had become more and more common. The Special Attack Forces were created with a straightforward goal in mind, the most destructive effect with the lowest cost in terms of both materials and people, and so there were new vehicles designed just to service this end. Atsushi Takasuka has explained how that worked. The little suicide crash boats meant to sink ships just off the coast were made almost entirely of wood. Only one person navigated it, and it just ran on an old Toyota motor. All of that extra space and money went towards loading the boat up with explosives. When it came to the kamikaze pilots, they got specific planes called the Oka. These were basically little gliders with a bunch of explosives shoved into the nose. They didn't have anything unnecessary. They were even hooked onto the bottom of a larger plane rather than taking off on their own, with parts made out of wood instead of metal. It didn't need to be strong after all. They weren't all that fast or even maneuverable, but they got the job done. That said, not all of the planes were specially made for suicide missions. The Guardian says that by the end of the war, old planes were also being used, stripped of radio equipment and weapons and loaded with explosives. One of the myths out there surrounding kamikaze pilots is that they were untrained and Japan just needed bodies to fly planes into ships. To be entirely fair, there is a little bit of truth behind it. Atsushi Takasuka said in an interview that, yes, the military was beginning to pull kamikaze pilots from those who were only partially done with their training. But they didn't get zero training, they just got different, more practical training. After all, flying in a kamikaze mission is really different from flying, well, any other kind of mission. They had to know how to deal with the weird problems like gravity when they would be dropped off the bottom of another plane. That's not exactly a normal situation. And since they were dive bombing at other craft, they had to be able to deal with that sort of piloting. Sometimes that training involved piloting straight towards the ground, then turning upward at the last moment, while at other times, apparently it included being launched from a catapult. Even though Japan was deeply desperate for more manpower, it wasn't like they just forced people to become kamikaze pilots. They had a choice. Except, did they really? So yes, there were technically questionnaires handed out regarding recruitment as a kamikaze pilot. That's true. Stories collected by The Guardian and National News refer to some similar circumstances. Recruits were given a slip of paper with 3 options. I passionately wish to join, I wish to join, and I don't wish to join. The wording varies slightly by account, but the gist is the same. Atsushi Takasuka mentions the same sort of thing. They were taken into a room and given 5 minutes to decide if they would volunteer, decline, or let their commander decide. Another story reported on by the BBC mentions that pilots were sometimes corralled into a big group and asked to volunteer. On the surface, it does sound democratic, and it did start that way. But later, there was just the appearance of choice. The use of big groups peer pressured everyone into volunteering, and even when 3 choices were given, most of the men knew that there was only one right answer. It was a scary thought to refuse, and sometimes even those who dared to opt out would supposedly be brought back and told to pick the right answer. Even though volunteering for becoming a kamikaze pilot was a little less democratic, that didn't mean that all of the men went unwillingly. A number of them were actually eager. Osamu Yamada told the BBC that when the call came for kamikaze pilots, he joined willingly. He was single at the time and had nothing holding him back. The ideology of the kamikaze pilots felt pure, a genuine love of country and a willingness to die in defense of it. The Guardian talked to Hisao Horiyama, who made a pretty similar statement. At one point, Emperor Hirohito personally visited his unit.
陛下から頼まれたんだと。死んでもやろうと。
It was a worthy cause, and even then, it wasn't like he thought much about dying. It was just his duty, but also he saw it as a path toward glory, a way to finally prove himself to his father. That glory is something Atsushi Takasuka mentioned too. Most of the kamikaze pilots were young, 17 or 18 years old, and they wanted to make a name for themselves as teenagers do. That was just compounded with the competitive nature of the military. There's kind of been a tendency to paint the kamikaze pilots as hyper-patriotic and reckless, willing to die without a second thought. But for as well as that might fit into a movie, the truth is a lot darker. A majority of the pilots probably didn't think that way. They didn't want to die. Takehito Ena told The Guardian that he remembered the moment he found out he'd been chosen. He'd been a university student, and at the news he, quote, felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered everyone congratulating each other and then telling himself that he'd been chosen for this, but deep down, he realized that there was nothing to celebrate and he was just scared. A lot of them were. Kiichi Kuwahara has a similar tale. As reported by the BBC, he was only 17 when he felt his fate had been sealed. He didn't feel any of that patriotic fervor. He could just think of his family, of his mother and sister whom he was sending money to. The last thing he wanted to do was leave them alone, and he just wasn't ready to die. Both men were glad they didn't have to. Kuwahara's engines malfunctioned, and he felt fear turn to relief when he had to return, and Ena recalled feeling glad that the war was over. It was a chance to look forward and rebuild instead. All of the kamikaze pilots had to come face to face with an almost certain truth. They were going to die. Some were willing, some weren't, and some only did it for each other so that their friends might not have to make the same sacrifice. But the same sad truth awaited almost all of them. Their last few days and hours were fittingly somber. Atsushi Takasuka explained that there was no pomp and circumstance, no ceremony, no ritual. What they did was really just up to the pilots. Some would bury locks of their hair behind shrines. Others would drink their anxieties and fears away. Sometimes they were given a few days of vacation to go back home and see their families one last time. Then on the last day of the mission, their last few minutes were spent aimed at an enemy craft with the instruction to send one last Morse code message, just a long, uninterrupted signal. And on the receiving end, if that long signal just ended with sudden silence, then the mission was successful.
死んでもその任務を達成するんだ。
The kamikaze pilots have since been associated with the Japanese cherry blossom, and for poignant reasons. In a way, the cherry blossom signifies a detachment to life, says Takasuka. It's simple and beautiful, but impermanent. It won't last forever, but there was something beautiful in that. The post-war period wasn't kind to the pilots either. The Allies occupied Japan for about 7 years following the end of the war, and they had it in mind to ruin the reputation of the kamikaze pilots. The pilots weren't heroes. Instead, they were painted as insane fanatics, too reckless for their own good, according to Atsushi Takasuka. The new government really wanted to push that, and eventually the public treated them with indifference at best, or contempt at worst. Suddenly, it was hard for them to find jobs or even apply to schools. A stigma had emerged about them, and the special attack syndrome seemed to imply that they couldn't return to normal lives. They'd been obsessed with dying with honor and couldn't find a new purpose. But that was based on little fact. Yes, that adjustment was hard for some of them, but can you really blame them? They trained themselves to accept death. It's an extreme mindset to come back from. Sadly, though, those assumptions haven't really gone away. Some younger generations in Japan who grew up with a pacifist constitution see them as idiotic, and the views from other countries like America are even worse. The view that they were suicidal fanatics who loved death is still around, and using kamikaze as slang for reckless and insane really plays into that negative view, even if passively. During the war, Japanese nationalism saw to it that kamikaze pilots were seen widely as heroes. The Air Force had become a viable and respected career. Advertising shot through the roof, too, with posters saying to move forward, 100 million, you are fireballs. It was all an ideological ploy so that the public would look up to the kamikaze pilots. After the war, that sentiment completely fell apart, but in the decades after, it came back. As early as 1952, nationalists wanted to rewrite the antagonistic narrative the Allies had left. The pilots' actions weren't shameful and weren't a crime by any means. They really pushed this view through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to little resistance. The pilots became seen as heroes again. And that's largely been the case in Japan through to this day. They weren't nameless, faceless masses, but individual people, a lot of them really young and well-educated. But above all, they were brave. There's a purity in being able to do the brave thing, even in the face of absolutely hopeless odds. But that's what the pilots did, and they deserve honor for that. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more messed up history videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.